Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into the warmth of a Victorian parlor, where the flicker of candlelight catches on glass ornaments and the scent of roasted goose mingles with pine. We're exploring the Christmas you think you know, tracing it back to the people who shaped it, the queen who embraced it, and the ordinary families who made it their own. This isn't about glittering legends or perfect celebrations. This is about how one era transformed a half-forgotten holiday into the centerpiece of the year. How traditions were borrowed, invented, and stitched together into something that still echoes in every decoration we hang and every carol we sing. If these slow journeys through history help you drift into sleep, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly bring you peace. And if you'd like, hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into the warmth of a Victorian parlor, where the flicker of candlelight catches on glass ornaments, and the scent of roasted goose mingles with pine. We're exploring the Christmas you think you know, tracing it back to the people who shaped it, the queen who embraced it, and the ordinary families who made it their own. This isn't about glittering legends or perfect celebrations. This is about how one era transformed a half-forgotten holiday into the centerpiece of the year. How traditions were borrowed, invented, and stitched together into something that still echoes in every decoration we hang and every carol we sing. If these slow journeys through history help you drift into sleep, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly bring you peace. And if you'd like to support this channel as we continue exploring the quieter corners of the past, your help means more than you know. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is where you are, and whether you've already put up your Christmas decorations, or if you're waiting just a bit longer. There's something comforting about knowing we're all drifting off to the same gentle stories. So, dim the lights, settle beneath your warmest blanket, and let's begin our journey into the Victorian Christmas, where tradition was born from transformation. Christmas before Victoria, a holiday half forgotten. Picture England in the year 1836, just before Victoria ascends to the throne. Christmas exists, certainly, but not as you know it. Walk through the streets of London in late December, and you'll find something closer to an ordinary day than a celebration. Most shops remain open. Factories hum with their usual rhythms. The workers who toil 12 or 14 hours a day see no break in their schedules, no pause for festivity, no acknowledgement that the 25th of December holds any particular magic. For them, it's Tuesday or Wednesday, another day of survival in an increasingly industrial world. The Christmas that does exist lives mostly in memory and in scattered rural traditions that feel ancient and half-abandoned. In some villages, you might still find remnants of older customs, the kinds of celebrations that stretch back to medieval times and beyond. These weren't the cozy, family-centered gatherings we imagine today. Medieval Christmas had been raucous, sometimes chaotic, a 12-day festival marked by feasting, drinking, and role reversals, where the social order temporarily relaxed. The lord of misrule might reign for a night. Servants might demand food and drink from their masters, and the whole affair carried an edge of disorder that made authorities nervous. By the early 1800s, much of that rowdy energy had faded. Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans had banned Christmas celebrations entirely back in 1647, viewing them as dangerously pagan and morally suspect. Though the ban lasted only until 1660, it disrupted centuries of tradition. Christmas never quite recovered its vigor. The songs people had sung, the customs they had practiced, the sense of community that gathered around the winter solstice, all of it had been scattered, suppressed, and only partially remembered. What remained in the early Victorian period was fragmented. In the countryside, some families still brought evergreen boughs into their homes, hung holly and ivy as their ancestors had done, and gathered for a special meal if they could afford one. But in the growing cities, where more and more people had migrated for factory work, these traditions held no purchase. There were no Christmas trees. No one had heard of Christmas crackers. Christmas cards didn't exist. The figure we now call Santa Claus or Father Christmas was virtually unknown in Britain. Gift-giving, when it happened at all, was reserved for the New Year, not Christmas Day. Religious observance provided the day's only real distinction. Churches held services, of course, and the faithful attended to mark the birth of Christ. But even here, the celebration felt subdued. Church decorations were minimal. Carol singing had fallen out of fashion, considered either too frivolous or too reminiscent of those dangerous medieval excesses. A few hymns might be sung, prayers offered, and then everyone went home to a day that looked much like any other. For the wealthy, Christmas meant a bit more. The aristocracy and landed gentry might host larger dinners, invite guests, and mark the season with some ceremony. But even among the upper classes, Christmas wasn't the grand affair it would become. It was pleasant, perhaps, a chance to enjoy good food and company, but not the emotional centerpiece of the year. No one traveled great distances to be home for Christmas. No one felt the pull of obligation and sentiment that would soon define the holiday. The working poor had even less reason to celebrate. With no time off work, no extra money for special food, and no traditions to fall back on, agricultural laborers earning 5 shillings a week couldn't save enough for a special meal. Factory workers had no choice but to show up at their machines or risk losing their positions. For many, the holiday meant nothing more than watching the wealthy eat better food while they continued to scrape by. In this context, the idea that Christmas would become the most important holiday in the British calendar seemed almost impossible. The pieces were scattered, the energy was gone, and the rapid changes of the Industrial Revolution seemed to be pulling society away from old celebrations rather than toward them. People worked longer hours, lived in more crowded conditions, and had less connection to the agricultural rhythms that had once dictated the calendar of festivals and rest days. But something was stirring beneath the surface. The very forces that seemed to be destroying old traditions would soon create the conditions for new ones. The factories that kept workers from celebrating would eventually produce the decorations, toys, and goods that made celebration accessible. The railways that carried people away from their villages would soon carry them home for family gatherings. The wealth generated by industry would create a new middle class with time and money to spend on leisure and festivity. All it needed was a spark, a model to follow, a vision of what Christmas could be. That spark would come from an unexpected source. A young queen and her German husband who would reshape not just the monarchy, but the very rhythm of British life. They would take fragments of tradition, add German customs, blend in sentimental ideals about family and domesticity, and create something that felt both ancient and entirely new. But we're not quite there yet. For now, in these final years before Victoria's reign, Christmas remains a shadow. But something was stirring beneath the surface. The very forces that seemed to be destroying old traditions would soon create the conditions for new ones. The factories that kept workers from celebrating would eventually produce the decorations, toys, and goods that made celebration accessible. The railways that carried people away from their villages would soon carry them home for family gatherings. The wealth generated by industry would create a new middle class with time and money to spend on leisure and festivity. All it needed was a spark, a model to follow, a vision of what Christmas could be. That spark would come from an unexpected source, a young queen and her German husband who would reshape not just the monarchy, but the very rhythm of British life. They would take fragments of tradition, add German customs, blend in sentimental ideals about family and domesticity, and create something that felt both ancient and entirely new. But we're not quite there yet. For now, in these final years before Victoria's reign, Christmas remains a shadow, a holiday that barely registers in most people's lives, a day marked more by its absence than its presence. The carols are silent. The streets are ordinary. The homes are undecorated. Winter passes through December with barely a nod to the date on the calendar. This is the world Victoria would inherit, a world where Christmas was dying, or perhaps already dead. Within a few decades, she and her era would resurrect it, transform it, and make it so central to British culture that people would forget it had ever been otherwise. The Victorian Christmas would feel timeless, traditional, inevitable. But in truth, it was radical, modern, and utterly unprecedented. And it all began with a tree. The Royal Influence, Victoria and Albert's Christmas. When Victoria became queen in 1837 at the age of 18, she inherited a nation in flux. The Industrial Revolution was remaking Britain's landscape, economy, and social structure. Cities swelled with workers, factories multiplied, railways began connecting distant corners of the realm. Amidst all this change, the young queen represented something both modern and traditional, a monarch who would embrace progress while embodying the domestic virtues her subjects increasingly valued. But Victoria's most profound influence on British life might not have come from her alone. In 1840, she married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg, a German prince whose impact on British culture would be immeasurable. Albert was intelligent, serious-minded, and devoted to improving society through education, industry, and moral reform. He was also deeply attached to the customs of his homeland, particularly the German traditions surrounding Christmas. In Germany, Christmas had remained a more vibrant celebration than in Britain. German families had long practiced the custom of bringing evergreen trees indoors and decorating them with candles, fruit, and small ornaments. Children received gifts. Families gathered for special meals. The holiday centered on home and hearth, on intimate gatherings rather than public revelry. These traditions suited Albert's temperament and his vision of what family life should be. Albert brought these customs with him to England, and Victoria, deeply in love with her husband, embraced them wholeheartedly. At Windsor Castle in 1841, the royal family set up their first Christmas tree, a tradition Albert had known since childhood. The tree was decorated with candles, small toys, sweets, and gilded ornaments. Gifts were arranged on tables beneath it, unwrapped and displayed so everyone could admire them. The children were delighted. Victoria was charmed, and the stage was set for a transformation. For several years, the royal Christmas remained a private affair, a family celebration known only to those within the palace walls. But in 1848, something changed that would alter British Christmas traditions forever. The Illustrated London News published an engraving showing the royal family around their Christmas tree. There was Victoria, young and beautiful, standing beside her handsome husband. Their children clustered around them, faces bright with wonder. The tree rose behind them, its branches heavy with ornaments and flickering candles, a perfect symbol of family harmony and festive joy. The image captured the public imagination immediately. Here was the Queen, the most important woman in the empire, celebrating Christmas like an ordinary family, or rather, showing ordinary families how they might celebrate Christmas. The engraving was widely circulated, copied, and discussed. Middle-class families across Britain saw it and thought, we could do that. We could have a tree. We could gather our children. We could make Christmas special in our own homes. The timing was perfect. The expanding middle class had both the means and the desire to emulate royal customs. They wanted respectability, domestic harmony, and traditions that marked them as cultured and proper. The Christmas tree, as popularized by Victoria and Albert, offered all of this. It was elegant but achievable, special but not extravagant, a way of bringing beauty and ceremony into the home without the rowdy excess of older Christmas celebrations. Victoria and Albert's Christmas celebrations continued to set the standard throughout their married life. At Windsor Castle and later at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, they established rituals that became widely known. Gifts were exchanged on Christmas Eve rather than Christmas morning, following German custom. The royal couple gave each other elaborate presents, jewelry and works of art and sculptures, demonstrating their mutual devotion. They gave gifts to their servants as well, boxes of clothing, toys, books, and food, acknowledging the importance of generosity and care for those in their household. The royal children participated fully in these celebrations. They made handmade gifts for their parents, paintings and embroidery and handcrafts that Victoria treasured and wrote about in her diaries. The emphasis was on thoughtfulness and sentiment rather than mere expense. This personal touch became part of the Victorian Christmas ideal, the idea that gifts should reflect genuine feeling and effort, not just purchasing power. After Albert's death in 1861, Victoria's approach to Christmas took on new meaning. She continued the traditions they had established together, making Christmas at Osborne a way of keeping Albert's memory alive. Every decoration, every gift exchange, every family gathering became a tribute to the husband she had lost. This added a layer of poignancy to Victorian Christmas celebrations, a recognition that the holiday carried emotional weight, that it was about memory and loss as well as joy and abundance. The royal family's influence extended beyond just the Christmas tree. They popularized specific foods as well. Turkey, which had been available in Britain since Tudor times but remained expensive, became the centerpiece of the royal Christmas dinner. By the end of Victoria's reign, turkey had become the standard Christmas bird for those who could afford it, replacing the goose or beef that had previously dominated festive tables. The royal couple's emphasis on family also shaped how Victorians understood Christmas. Before their example, Christmas had been more about community celebration, about public festivals and communal feasting. Victoria and Albert made it intimate, domestic, something that happened within the walls of the home among blood relatives. This suited the Victorian obsession with domesticity and the ideal of separate spheres, where home was a sanctuary from the harsh industrial world outside. Victoria herself was an enthusiastic participant in all things Christmas. Her diaries record her excitement about decorating, her pleasure in watching her children's reactions, her careful attention to gift selection. She wasn't merely tolerating royal custom, she genuinely loved Christmas and the way it brought her family together. That authenticity came through in the public perception of royal celebrations and made them all the more appealing to emulate. The press played a crucial role in spreading the royal Christmas model. Newspapers and magazines published detailed accounts of how the royal family celebrated, what they ate, how they decorated, what gifts they exchanged. Middle-class readers devoured these details, eager for guidance on how to create their own proper Christmas celebrations. The royal example provided a template, a set of practices that felt both aspirational and achievable. Of course, the royal influence had its limits. Working-class families couldn't afford elaborate decorations or expensive gifts. Rural communities continued their own local traditions regardless of what happened at Windsor. But for the growing middle class, the royal Christmas became the ideal to which they aspired. It gave them permission to invest time, money, and emotion in the holiday, to make it a priority in ways their parents and grandparents never had. Victoria's long reign, from 1837 to 1901, meant that her version of Christmas had decades to take root and spread. By the time she died, the Christmas she had helped create felt traditional and timeless, as if it had always existed. People forgot that their grandparents had barely celebrated the holiday. They forgot that the Christmas tree was a recent German import. They forgot that gift-giving on Christmas Day was a Victorian innovation. The new traditions had become the old traditions, and Victoria and Albert were at the center of that transformation. The royal Christmas also created a market for Christmas goods. Manufacturers saw that people wanted to decorate like the Queen, to have Christmas trees and ornaments and special foods. They began producing these items on a larger scale, making them more affordable and accessible. The royal example thus didn't just change cultural attitudes, it changed the economy, creating entire industries devoted to Christmas celebration. In this way, Victoria and Albert's private joy became public tradition. Their intimate family customs became national practices. Their German-British hybrid Christmas became simply the British Christmas, the way things were done, the natural and proper celebration of the season. And it all started with a young couple in love, a German prince's memories of childhood, and a newspaper illustration that showed Britain what Christmas could be. The Christmas Tree Revolution, from Germany to every parlor. The Christmas tree stands now as perhaps the most recognizable symbol of the holiday, so ubiquitous that we hardly question its presence. But in early Victorian England, the very idea of bringing a full-sized evergreen tree into the house would have seemed strange, impractical, possibly even slightly mad. Trees belonged in forests and gardens, not parlors. What kind of person decorates a tree and puts it in their sitting room? The answer, of course, was the Germans. The custom of decorating evergreen trees at Christmas time had deep roots in Germanic territories. Some historians trace it back to medieval mystery plays, where a paradise tree represented the Garden of Eden in nativity performances. Others connected to even older pagan traditions, when evergreens symbolized life persisting through winter's darkness. By the 18th century, decorated Christmas trees had become common in German homes, particularly among the Protestant population. These German trees were elaborate affairs. Families decorated them with apples representing the forbidden fruit, with candles representing Christ's light, with nuts and sweets representing abundance and blessing. Paper roses might be crafted and attached to branches. Glass ornaments, when families could afford them, added sparkle and color. The tree became a focal point for Christmas Eve celebrations, when gifts were distributed and the family gathered to sing and pray. When Prince Albert came to England in 1840, he brought this tradition with him, not as a conscious effort to change British culture, but simply as a way of maintaining connection to his childhood and homeland. That first Christmas tree at Windsor Castle wasn't intended as a public statement. It was Albert's way of giving his children what he had experienced, of passing on a tradition that meant something to him. But once that 1848 illustration appeared in the Illustrated London News, everything changed. Suddenly, everyone wanted a Christmas tree. The challenge was finding them. Britain didn't have a ready supply of evergreen trees of appropriate size. Norway spruce, which would become the classic Christmas tree, had to be imported or cultivated. In those early years, obtaining a tree required planning, expense, and effort. For those who could manage it, the rewards were considerable. Setting up a Christmas tree became an event in itself. a family ritual that marked the beginning of the Christmas season. The tree, usually 6 to 8 feet tall for a middle-class home, would be brought inside a few days before Christmas. It needed a stand, which might be improvised from a wooden bucket weighted with stones, or a specially made base, if the family could afford one. Decorating the tree was labor-intensive and, frankly, hazardous. Those candles that looked so beautiful in the illustrations posed a serious fire risk. Victorians knew this. House fires during Christmas season increased noticeably as the tree tradition spread. Families kept buckets of water nearby. They monitored their trees constantly when candles were lit. They extinguished them as soon as the immediate celebration ended. Even so, tragedies occurred. Dresses caught fire. Curtains ignited. Trees went up in flames. The Victorians accepted this risk as the price of beauty and tradition. The ornaments themselves tell a story of Victorian ingenuity and commerce. In the early years, decorations were homemade, following the German model. Families crafted paper chains from colored paper, cutting and gluing them together in long loops. They strung popcorn and cranberries. They made little baskets from woven paper and filled them with sweets. Children participated in this preparation, learning the value of handwork and anticipating the finished tree. But by the 1850s, commercial Christmas ornaments began appearing. The first advertisements for tree decorations appeared in 1853, just 5 years after that royal illustration. Manufacturers, mostly in Germany initially, produced glass balls, tin ornaments, and paper decorations that could be purchased rather than made. These early commercial ornaments were expensive, affordable only to the wealthy, but they represented the beginning of an industry that would grow exponentially. The ornaments themselves reflected Victorian tastes and values. Glass balls in traditional shapes, spheres and teardrops and icicles caught and reflected candlelight beautifully. Tin ornaments might be embossed with religious scenes, angels and nativity figures, or with secular symbols, stars and bells and animals. Paper decorations featured elaborate die-cut designs, sometimes gilded or silvered for extra sparkle. Each ornament was treasured, carefully wrapped and stored from year to year, often becoming family heirlooms passed through generations. Edible decorations remained important throughout the Victorian period. Gingerbread cookies cut into shapes and hung with ribbons. Candied fruits wrapped in colored paper. Small cakes baked specifically for the tree. These served dual purposes, decoration and treat, and children particularly loved them. The idea was to make the tree a cornucopia, a symbol of abundance and blessing, heavy with good things. At the top of the tree, Victorians placed either a star, representing the Star of Bethlehem, or an angel, representing the heavenly host. This became standard practice, another element of the Victorian Christmas that persists today. The tree topper was often the most elaborate ornament, made of porcelain or glass or metal, sometimes lit from within by a candle if the family was particularly ambitious and unconcerned about fire. The base of the tree also mattered. Gifts would be arranged here, unwrapped as Victoria preferred, so everyone could see what everyone else received. Sometimes the gifts sat on a white cloth meant to represent snow. Sometimes they were arranged on small platforms at different heights to create visual interest.
The presentation was important, part of the overall tableau of Christmas beauty and domestic harmony. As the tree tradition spread, differences emerged based on class and region. Wealthy families might have multiple trees, one in the main hall, another in the children's nursery, perhaps even one for the servants. These trees would be lavishly decorated with expensive ornaments and numerous candles. Middle-class families would have one tree in the parlor, modestly decorated, but still special, the centerpiece of their celebration. Working-class families, if they could afford a tree at all, might use a small tabletop tree or even just a branch decorated with homemade ornaments and whatever treats they could spare. By the 1860s, Christmas tree farms began appearing in Britain and the United States, cultivating trees specifically for the holiday market. This made trees more accessible and affordable. What had been a luxury became increasingly commonplace. Street vendors began selling trees in cities, making them available to urban families who had no access to forests. The ritual of selecting the tree became part of the tradition. Families would go together to choose their tree, debating its height and fullness and symmetry. Children would plead for the tallest or most perfect specimen. Parents would calculate whether it would fit through the door and not overwhelm the parlor. The chosen tree would be brought home, usually carried by father and sons, a physical act that involved the whole family in the celebration.
Decorating the tree happened over several days in many households. It wasn't done all at once, but rather built up gradually. Ornaments added as time allowed, the tree growing more beautiful each day. This prolonged the anticipation, made the tree a work in progress that everyone could contribute to. When at last it was complete, lit candles and all, the family would gather to admire it, often singing carols around it, creating a moment of unity and shared beauty. The Christmas tree also became a subject for artists and photographers. Victorian photographers, working with the still new technology, took family portraits beside Christmas trees, capturing for posterity the decorations and fashions and faces of that particular year. These photographs became treasured records, often the only images families had of their Christmas celebrations. They also helped spread the tree tradition, as people saw photographs of others' trees and wanted their own. By the end of Victoria's reign, the Christmas tree had become so thoroughly British that many people assumed it had always been part of their tradition. The German origins were forgotten or ignored. The tree felt ancient, rooted in British soil, despite its recent arrival. This is perhaps the greatest testament to how thoroughly the Victorians transformed Christmas. They made their innovations feel traditional, gave them the weight and authority of age, and convinced themselves and everyone else that this was the way Christmas had always been done. The tree also represented something beyond mere decoration. It symbolized the Victorian ideal of bringing nature into the cultivated space of the home, of taming wildness and making it beautiful. It represented abundance and generosity through its gifts and treats. It represented faith through its star or angel. It represented family through the collective effort of decorating and the shared joy of admiring. In one glowing, fragrant, slightly fire-prone package,
The Christmas tree embodied everything the Victorians wanted their Christmas to be. Christmas cards, sentiments by post. In 1843, Sir Henry Cole had a problem. Cole was an important man, the first director of what would become the Victoria and Albert Museum, a civil servant and reformer who had been instrumental in establishing the penny post just 3 years earlier. The penny post had revolutionized mail in Britain, making it possible for anyone to send a letter anywhere in the country for just 1 penny. The system was a triumph, wildly popular, and successful beyond anyone's expectations. But success brought its own complications. Cole found himself with a long list of friends and acquaintances to whom he owed Christmas greetings. The social expectation was to write personal letters, maintaining connections and wishing everyone well for the season. Cole, however, was a busy man, with more correspondence than hours in the day. He needed a more efficient solution. His answer was to commission an artist, John Calcott Horsley, to design a card that could be sent to multiple people. The resulting image showed a family gathered around a table, 3 generations sharing wine and clearly enjoying themselves. On the sides were smaller panels showing acts of charity, feeding the hungry and clothing the poor. The message across the top read simply, "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you." Cole had 1,000 of these cards printed. He sent some to his friends and family. He placed the rest on sale in his art shop for 1 shilling each, a not insignificant sum in 1843. The cards didn't exactly fly off the shelves. They were expensive, and the concept was unfamiliar. But the seed had been planted. The first Christmas card had entered the world. For the next few decades, Christmas cards remained something of a curiosity. A few people commissioned their own designs. A few commercial printers experimented with the format. But the practice didn't catch on widely. The turning point came in 1870, when the Postal Service introduced the halfpenny postage rate for cards. Suddenly, sending a Christmas card became affordable for nearly everyone. A halfpenny was within reach of working-class budgets. The practice exploded. By 1880, 11 million Christmas cards were sent in Britain annually. By the end of the century, that number would multiply many times over. Christmas cards had become an essential part of the holiday, a way of maintaining connections, demonstrating social status, and participating in the modern ritual of communication. The designs of Victorian Christmas cards were varied and sometimes bizarre. Religious themes appeared, of course. Nativity scenes, angels, churches in snow, all the imagery we might expect. But Victorian cards also featured robins. These became especially popular as the robin was associated with postmen who wore red uniforms. Winter landscapes appeared frequently. Snowy cottages and frozen ponds and people skating or sledding. These created a nostalgic vision of Christmas past, rural and picturesque. But then there were the strange ones. Victorians, for reasons that remained somewhat mysterious, enjoyed putting rather morbid or peculiar images on their Christmas cards. Dead robins appeared not infrequently, lying stiff in the snow, sometimes with sympathetic mice standing over them. Frogs dressed in human clothes. Aggressive-looking vegetables. Images of dead game birds hanging ready for the pot. Anthropomorphized insects engaged in various activities. The Victorian sense of humor and their attitudes towards death gave their Christmas cards a flavor quite different from modern sentiments. Some Victorian Christmas cards included jokes or puns. Others included lengthy verses, poetry about friendship or the season, or memories of Christmases past. The messages could be sentimental to the point of saccharine, or surprisingly cynical. Some cards mocked the very idea of Christmas sentiment while participating in the tradition of sending them. This self-awareness was very Victorian, embracing a custom while simultaneously commenting on its artificiality. The production of Christmas cards became a significant industry. Artists and lithographers were commissioned to create designs. Printers specialized in card production. Paper suppliers found a booming market. The cards were made using various techniques: chromolithography for color, embossing for texture, sometimes incorporating fabric or ribbon or dried flowers. The more elaborate cards were expensive and served as status symbols, a way of showing that you could afford to send something special. Receiving Christmas cards became a ritual in itself. Families would display the cards they received, arranging them on mantels or stringing them across walls. The number of cards you received indicated your social connections and standing. A mantel crowded with cards suggested popularity and importance. A sparse display suggested limited social reach. Thus, sending cards was partially about making sure you received enough in return. Children got involved in card giving as well. As prices dropped and production increased, children could afford to buy or make cards for their friends and family members. Schools incorporated card making into their Christmas activities. Children learned to write appropriate greetings, to address envelopes properly, to navigate the social expectations around card exchange. This became part of their education in Victorian manners and etiquette. Homemade cards remained common throughout the Victorian period, despite the availability of commercial options. Families with artistic inclinations would design and produce their own cards using watercolors, cutouts, pressed flowers, or other materials. These handmade cards were often treasured more than purchased ones, precisely because they demonstrated effort and personal attention. They were gifts as much as greetings. The Christmas card also created new social anxieties. Should you send a card to everyone who sent you one? What if you forgot someone? What if your cards weren't as nice as those you received? What did it mean if someone who usually sent you a card didn't this year? The seemingly simple act of card sending became freighted with social meaning and potential embarrassment. Some Victorians resisted the card-sending custom. They saw it as commercialized and insincere, a replacement for genuine personal connection with mass-produced sentiment. Critics argued that people were sending cards to hundreds of barely known acquaintances while neglecting real relationships with close friends and family. The debate sounds remarkably modern. The same tensions between convenience and authenticity that characterize so many of our contemporary holiday practices. The card industry responded to criticism and changing tastes by continually innovating. Pop-up cards appeared with three-dimensional scenes that emerged when opened. Musical cards played tinny tunes when a pull tab was activated. Perfumed cards released scent. Puzzle cards required assembly. The goal was always to create something novel, something that would stand out from the dozens or hundreds of other cards the recipient might receive. The messages inside cards evolved as well. The straightforward Merry Christmas of Cole's original design gave way to elaborate verses, often printed but sometimes handwritten, expressing increasingly specific sentiments. Cards for different relationships emerged, special designs and messages for parents, children, siblings, friends, employers, employees. The card industry segmented the market, offering something for every conceivable connection. By the end of the Victorian era, Christmas cards had become so essential to the holiday that not sending them was notable. The practice had spread beyond Britain to America and other English-speaking countries. The industrial printing processes developed for cards would later be applied to other products. The seasonal employment generated by card production provided jobs for artists, printers, and postal workers. The Christmas card thus represented several Victorian innovations at once. It was a product of industrial printing technology. It was enabled by postal reform. It reflected Victorian sentimentality and their complex attitudes toward death and nature. It created a new form of social obligation and communication. And it gave physical form to the Victorian desire to maintain connections and express proper feeling, even when genuine personal interaction wasn't possible. Today, as email and social media replace physical cards for many people, we might look back on the Victorian invention with mixed feelings. It was both sincere and commercial, both personal and mass-produced, both a genuine expression of goodwill and a social obligation that generated its own anxieties. It was, in other words, perfectly Victorian, and perfectly in keeping with the complicated, contradictory, intensely sentimental Christmas they were creating. Christmas crackers and Victorian innovations. Tom Smith was a confectioner, owner of a sweet shop in London in the 1840s. During a trip to Paris, he observed French bonbons wrapped in twisted paper with sweet sayings inside. The presentation charmed him. The bright paper, the surprise message, the moment of unwrapping. He thought it could work in England, perhaps as a Christmas novelty. Back in London, Smith began selling bonbons wrapped in similar fashion. They sold reasonably well, but didn't set the world on fire. Something was missing, some element of excitement or surprise. According to legend, Smith found his answer one evening while sitting by his fireplace. A log cracked loudly as it burned, sending sparks up the chimney. That sound, that sudden pop, gave him an idea. Smith experimented with chemicals and paper, looking for a way to create a safe but satisfying bang. He eventually developed a mechanism using 2 strips of chemically treated paper that, when pulled sharply, would create a sharp crack. The Christmas cracker, or bangs of expectations as they were initially called, was born.
The first Christmas crackers appeared for sale in the late 1840s. They contained a sweet, a paper hat, and a slip of paper with a motto or joke printed on it. When 2 people pulled the cracker from opposite ends, it would snap apart with a satisfying crack,
and the contents would tumble out. The winner, whoever ended up with the larger piece, got to keep the contents. The crackers were an immediate hit. They combined several elements that appealed to Victorian sensibilities. There was surprise. You never quite knew what motto or prize you'd get. There was ritual. The ceremony of pulling crackers at Christmas dinner became standard practice. There was a small element of competition, fighting for the larger half. And there was that delightful noise, loud enough to startle, but not so loud as to genuinely frighten. As the cracker tradition caught on, Smith and his competitors expanded the range of contents. The sweets remained, but they were joined by small toys, jewelry for more expensive crackers, novelty items, and increasingly elaborate paper hats. The hats became almost as important as the crack itself. Worn throughout Christmas dinner, they added a festive, slightly silly element to the proceedings. Even dignified adults would wear the paper crowns, temporarily casting aside Victorian reserve for Christmas levity. The jokes and mottos inside crackers deserve special mention. They were often terrible, groaning-inducing puns that would make a modern dad joke seem sophisticated. Why did the turkey join the band? Because it had the drumsticks. That kind of thing. The jokes were printed on slips of colored paper, and people would read them aloud, leading to much groaning and laughing around the table. The worse the joke, somehow the better. It became part of the tradition. More expensive crackers might contain fortunes, romantic suggestions for young people, or wisdom sayings meant to guide the coming year. Some crackers included small puzzles or riddles. Others had miniature games. The crackers became a vehicle for all sorts of novelties, a way of packaging entertainment and surprise in a colorful, noisy form. The crack itself, that sound, became psychologically associated with Christmas. Victorian children would hear that distinctive snap and know Christmas had arrived. Adults would smile at the sound, remembering their own childhoods. The noise was permission to relax, to set aside normal deportment, to embrace the festive chaos of the day. Crackers also became status symbols of a sort. Wealthy families might have elaborate crackers with expensive contents, real jewelry or silver trinkets. Middle-class families would have standard crackers from respectable shops. Working-class families, if they had crackers at all, might have simpler versions with minimal contents. But everyone wanted them. They represented participation in modern Christmas celebration. The Christmas pudding ritual also evolved during the Victorian period, becoming more standardized and ceremonial. The pudding itself, a dense mixture of dried fruits, suet, sugar, spices, and alcohol, had existed for centuries in various forms. But the Victorians turned it into an event. The tradition of making the pudding on Stir-Up Sunday, the 5th Sunday before Christmas, became firmly established in Victorian's reign. This was the day the household would gather to mix the pudding ingredients. Each family member would take a turn stirring the mixture from east to west, representing the journey of the Magi, while making a wish. Silver coins were often added to the pudding, and whoever found a coin in their serving on Christmas Day would have good luck in the coming year. The pudding would then age for several weeks, allowing the flavors to mellow and meld. On Christmas Day, it would be brought to the table with great ceremony, often doused in brandy and set alight. The flaming pudding, carried into a darkened dining room, provided a spectacular moment. The blue flames dancing over the dark pudding created an almost magical effect, and Victorian families treated it with appropriate reverence. The pudding itself was rich to the point of overwhelming. Dense, sweet, heavily spiced, soaked in alcohol, it was not to everyone's taste. But eating it was obliging. To refuse Christmas pudding was to refuse Christmas itself. The pudding represented abundance, tradition, the mixing together of many elements into a harmonious whole. It was Christmas in edible form. Mince pies also underwent Victorian transformation. Earlier versions had actually contained minced meat along with the fruits and spices. By Victorian times, the meat had largely disappeared, leaving the sweet, spiced mixture we know today. The pies were small, meant to be eaten in 1 or 2 bites, and tradition held that you should eat 1 mince pie on each of the 12 days of Christmas to ensure 12 months of good luck. Victorian mince pies were sometimes made in the shape of a manger, a nod to the Nativity. This was particularly common earlier in the era and gradually faded from practice. But it showed how the Victorians were constantly trying to infuse their Christmas celebrations with religious meaning along with the increasingly secular and commercial elements. The Yule log tradition, ancient in origin, was maintained and adapted by the Victorians. The log, chosen on Christmas Eve, would be brought inside with ceremony. Sometimes it was decorated with ribbons or evergreens before being placed in the fireplace. The goal was to keep it burning throughout the Christmas season, a symbol of warmth and continuity. A piece of the log would be saved to light next year's fire, maintaining an unbroken chain across the years. In homes without large fireplaces, the Yule log might be represented by a decorative log centerpiece for the table. Later, as the tradition evolved, the Yule log became a dessert, a rolled cake decorated to look like a log, complete with bark-like icing and sugared holly. This culinary adaptation showed the Victorian talent for transforming old customs into new form.
These innovations, the crackers, the ceremonial pudding, the adapted mince pies, the Yule log, all worked together to create a Christmas that felt rich with ritual. Each element had its moment, its particular ceremony, its associated meanings. The Victorians were constructing Christmas as a carefully choreographed series of events, each building on the last, creating an overall experience that felt both indulgent and meaningful. The Victorian feast, food, drink, and class. The centerpiece of the Victorian Christmas dinner, for those who could afford it, was the turkey. Today, we take turkey's association with Christmas for granted, but in the early part of Victoria's reign, it was far from standard. Turkeys had been brought to Britain from the Americas in the 16th century, but they remained expensive luxuries through the 18th and into the 19th century. Most families ate goose for Christmas, if they ate special meat at all. In northern England, roast beef was traditional. The poor made do with rabbit or whatever they could manage.
The turkey's rise to Christmas dominance is a story of changing economics and agricultural practice. By mid-century, more turkeys were being raised in Britain, particularly in Norfolk. These birds had to reach the London markets somehow, and the journey was remarkable. Starting in October, turkeys would be fitted with little leather boots, yes, actual boots, to protect their feet during the long walk to London. The journey of 80 miles or so would take weeks. Upon arrival, thin and exhausted, the turkeys would be fattened for the final few weeks before Christmas, then slaughtered and sold. For the wealthy, turkey was just one element of an elaborate feast. The royal family's Christmas dinner in 1840 included not just turkey, but beef, several game birds, and even roasted swan, a medieval throwback that demonstrated wealth and status. Multiple courses would follow one after another: soups and salads, various meats, vegetables, both seasonal and hothouse grown out of season, demonstrating the family's resources. The middle-class Christmas dinner was more modest, but still substantial. Turkey with stuffing, potatoes, Brussels sprouts, which became associated with Christmas during this period, bread sauce, and gravy. This would be followed by Christmas pudding, mince pies, and perhaps other sweets. The meal represented a significant expense, the result of saving and planning throughout the year. For many middle-class families, Christmas dinner was the most elaborate meal they would eat all year. The working class faced greater challenges. A goose was more affordable than turkey, and many working families joined goose clubs, saving small amounts throughout the year specifically to purchase their Christmas bird. These clubs, often organized through pubs or employers, allowed people to pay in installments, making the feast possible for those who couldn't afford a lump sum expenditure. On Christmas morning, bakers' ovens would be filled with geese and small roasts brought by families who lacked proper cooking facilities at home. The baker would cook these birds for a small fee, and families would collect them in time for dinner. For the very poor, even a goose was out of reach. Some might manage a chicken or a piece of beef. Others ate their usual fare, perhaps with a bit of extra bread or a luxury item if charity provided it. The contrast between the rich Christmas feast and the poor Christmas meal was stark, and Victorians were increasingly aware of this inequality, particularly after Charles Dickens made it impossible to ignore. Drinks also varied by class. The wealthy might serve champagne or fine wines with their Christmas meal. The middle class would have ale or modest wine. Working families would have ale if they were fortunate, water or tea if not. A special Victorian Christmas drink was smoking bishop, a type of mulled wine made with port, roasted oranges, and spices. Charles Dickens references this drink in A Christmas Carol, and it became fashionable among those who could afford it. Wassail, an older tradition, continued in various forms. This spiced, warm cider drink was associated with wassailing, the practice of going door to door singing for treats. The word wassail comes from the Old English toast, was hail, meaning be healthy. Wassail bowls would be filled with this warm, aromatic drink, and visitors would be offered a cup. The tradition had social elements, bringing community together in ways that the increasingly private, domestic Victorian Christmas might otherwise lose. Sweets and candies played an enormous role in Victorian Christmas, particularly for children. The Industrial Revolution made sugar more affordable and candy production more efficient. Peppermint sticks, sugar plums, which were actually sugar-coated seeds and nuts rather than plums, crystallized fruits, and elaborate sugar sculptures all appeared at Christmas. Confectioners created elaborate displays in their shop windows, often including scenes from Christmas stories or fairy tales built entirely from sugar and chocolate. For wealthy families, the dessert table might include multiple puddings, various pastries, hothouse fruits like pineapples and grapes, nuts, crystallized fruits, and decorative sugarwork. The display was as important as the eating. Victorian dinner parties were performances, and the food was part of the spectacle. Christmas cakes, heavy fruit cakes covered in marzipan and royal icing, became standard by the end of the century. These cakes were prepared weeks in advance, allowed to mature, and then decorated elaborately. The white icing was meant to represent snow, and decorative elements, sugar bells, holly sprigs of icing, small figurines would adorn the top. Oysters were another surprisingly common element of Victorian Christmas meals, particularly for the middle and upper classes. Oyster soup might begin the meal, or raw oysters might be served on the half shell. In the Victorian period, oysters were relatively cheap and readily available, quite different from their status as luxury items today. Even working-class families in coastal areas might have access to oysters, and canned oysters made them available inland as well.
The preparation of the Christmas feast was elaborate and exhausting. Middle-class households without servants would spend days preparing. Those with servants would still supervise extensively, ensuring everything was perfect. Recipes had to be followed carefully, timing coordinated so all dishes finished together, and presentation attended to with great care. For servants themselves, Christmas presented a paradox. They would spend Christmas Day cooking and serving the elaborate feast their employers enjoyed, often while their own families celebrated without them. However, servants could generally expect special treatment on Christmas. Extra food, small gifts, perhaps a few hours off in the evening. And on Boxing Day, December 26th, they would have their own celebration, eating the leftovers from the main feast and enjoying a rare day of rest. The class divisions around Christmas food bothered many Victorians. The contrast between the groaning tables of the wealthy and the bare tables of the poor seemed particularly cruel during a season supposedly about goodwill and charity. This tension drove much of the philanthropic activity around Christmas, with the wealthy making efforts to ensure the poor had at least one good meal during the season. Workhouses, which housed the destitute, were supposed to provide special Christmas dinners for their inmates. The quality and generosity varied widely. Some workhouses served substantial meals of beef and plum pudding. Others provided only slightly better than usual rations. Middle-class reformers and journalists paid attention to workhouse Christmas dinners, publicizing the good ones and shaming the inadequate ones, putting pressure on workhouse managers to observe the holiday properly. Churches and charitable organizations organized Christmas dinners for the poor, feeding hundreds or even thousands of people in church halls and public spaces. These charity dinners often included entertainment, carols, and small gifts for children. For many poor children, these charity events provided their only experience of Christmas abundance. The emphasis on food at Christmas reflected broader Victorian anxieties about abundance and scarcity, about who deserved comfort and who must do without. Food was not just sustenance, but a marker of status, morality, and social membership. To eat well at Christmas was to participate in civilization and community.
To go hungry was to be excluded from both. This made the Christmas feast politically and morally charged in ways we might not immediately recognize. Every turkey or goose represented choices about how resources were distributed. Every charity dinner was a small acknowledgement that the regular distribution of resources was inadequate. Every contrast between rich and poor tables was a reminder that Victorian prosperity was far from universal. Music, carols, and wassailing, the soundtrack of Christmas. Music fills our modern Christmas, inescapable in shops and on the radio from November onward. But in early Victorian times, Christmas music had nearly died out. The carols that had once been sung were largely forgotten. Church services were musically subdued. The raucous public singing of earlier eras had been suppressed. Christmas was relatively silent. The revival of Christmas carol singing was a deliberate, almost archaeological project. In the 1830s and 40s, antiquarians like William Sandys and Davies Gilbert traveled through rural England collecting the carols that older people could still remember. These collectors were motivated by a sense that something valuable was being lost, that these songs connected Victorians to their past and should be preserved. Sandys published his collection, Christmas Carols Ancient and Modern, in 1833, included the words and music to over 100 carols, some dating back to medieval times, others more recent. Many had been passed down orally, sung in particular villages or regions, never written down before. Without Sandys' efforts, many of these carols would have been lost entirely. Gilbert published his own smaller collections, focusing on carols from the West Country. Other collectors worked in different regions. Gradually, a body of Christmas music was reassembled from fragmentary memories and local traditions. These published collections made the carols accessible to middle-class families who had pianos or other musical instruments in their homes. The publication of Christmas Carols New and Old by Henry Ramsden Bramley and Sir John Stainer in 1871 marked another significant moment. This collection combined traditional carols with newly composed ones, creating a repertoire that would define Victorian Christmas music. It was widely sold and used, becoming a standard reference for church choirs and family sing-alongs. Some of the carols we consider most traditional today were actually written during the Victorian period. O Little Town of Bethlehem was written in 1868 by Phillips Brooks, an American minister, though it was quickly adopted in Britain. Away in a Manger, often mistakenly attributed to Martin Luther, dates to the 1880s, likely also American in origin, but widely sung in Victorian Britain by the end of the century. We Three Kings was written by John Henry Hopkins, Jr. in 1857. Good King Wenceslas was written in 1853 by John Mason Neale. These new compositions were often based on older melodies or borrowed tunes from folk songs. The Victorians were skilled at making new things feel traditional, giving recent compositions the patina of age through musical style and subject matter. A carol written in 1850 could sound to Victorian ears as if it dated from the Middle Ages. God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen provides an interesting case. This carol dates from at least the 18th century, possibly earlier. But by 1833, when it was first published, it had nearly died out. Only one carol was generally known in London at that time, and this was it, sung mainly by poor street carolers. Sandys' publication preserved and spread it, and by the end of the Victorian era, it had become a beloved standard. Hark the Herald Angels Sing began as a poem by Charles Wesley in 1739, with the original first line reading, "Hark how all the welkin rings." The words were modified, and the carol wasn't paired with the Mendelssohn tune we know today until the mid-19th century. That pairing transformed it into the triumphant carol we recognize, and it became immediately popular in Victorian Britain. Silent Night arrived in Britain from Austria in the mid-19th century. Its simple, haunting melody and peaceful lyrics appealed to Victorian sensibilities. The story of its composition, supposedly written quickly when a church organ broke, added to its romance and ensured its popularity. By the end of Victorian's reign, it was firmly established in the British carol repertoire.
The practice of caroling, going door to door singing, was revived and reshaped during the Victorian period. Earlier versions had often been associated with wassailing, a tradition where groups would visit houses demanding food and drink, sometimes with mildly threatening overtones. By early Victorian times, this had degenerated into what was essentially begging by the poor, using carols as an excuse to ask for money. The Victorians cleaned up and sentimentalized the practice. Middle-class families began organizing carol-singing groups, going to neighbors' homes not to demand anything, but to offer entertainment and spread Christmas cheer. Church choirs would go caroling through their parishes. Charitable organizations used caroling as a way to raise money for the poor, legitimizing the practice while directing it toward approved ends. The Waits, originally licensed town musicians who had the exclusive right to perform in the streets, became associated with Christmas caroling. These musicians would play and sing during the Christmas season, though by Victorian times the strict licensing had broken down, and the term waits referred more generally to Christmas musicians. The waits might be heard in the evening, their voices and instruments carrying through the cold night air, alerting households that Christmas was approaching. Caroling created community in ways that the increasingly privatized Victorian Christmas might otherwise lack. When carol singers appeared at your door, you were expected to come out, listen, perhaps sing along, and offer some refreshment or a small donation. This brought people together, if only briefly, linking households in a network of musical celebration. Inside Victorian homes, carol singing around the piano became a standard Christmas evening activity. Families would gather, perhaps after Christmas dinner, and sing through their carol books. This required some musical ability, someone who could play piano with reasonable competence, but the Victorian middle class valued musical education, and most families had at least one member capable of accompanying the singing. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865, brought a new dimension to Christmas music. Army bands would play carols on street corners, collecting donations for their charitable work. Their brass bands, playing arrangements of traditional carols, became a familiar sound of Christmas in British cities. The Salvation Army helped make Christmas music public again, taking it out of private parlors and church services and into the streets where everyone could hear it. Churches struggled with how to incorporate carols into worship services.
Early in the Victorian period, carols were considered too secular or frivolous for formal church services. They were fine for home singing, but not appropriate for the liturgy. But gradually, attitudes shifted. Carol services began appearing, special evening services devoted to carol singing, where the usual formality could be relaxed. The service of 9 lessons and carols, first held at Truro Cathedral in 1880, represented a significant innovation. This service alternated scripture readings with carol singing, creating a structure that moved through the Christmas story while allowing congregational participation through music. The format was so successful that it spread to other churches, and a version held at King's College, Cambridge in 1918 became the model that millions would later hear on radio and television. The lyrics of Victorian carols often reflected the era's religious and social preoccupations. Many emphasized charitable themes, reminding the comfortable of their obligations to the poor. Some stressed domestic virtues, the importance of family and home. Others focused on traditional religious narratives, but with particularly Victorian emotional coloring, emphasizing sentiment and feeling along with faith. Some carols also reflected imperial themes or nationalistic sentiment, though this was more subtle. The idea of Britain bringing Christmas, and by extension Christian civilization, appeared in various texts. The Victorian Christmas was being exported to the colonies, and the music went with it, carrying British cultural values along with Christian religious content. By the end of Victorian's reign, the carol repertoire was firmly established. The essential carols had been revived or composed. The practice of caroling had been rehabilitated and made respectable. Churches had found ways to incorporate carols into worship. And every middle-class Victorian with any musical ability knew how to lead their family through "O Come All Ye Faithful" and "The First Noel" after Christmas dinner. The music had returned to Christmas, but it was a carefully curated, sentimentalized, domesticated music, appropriate for parlor and church, beautiful and moving, but never threatening or disorderly. The Victorians had taken the fragments of older traditions and rebuilt them into something new, something that served their values and their vision of what Christmas should be. The carols we sing today, many of them, are the carols the Victorians chose to preserve and promote. And when we sing them, we are hearing Christmas through their ears, understanding the holiday through their sensibilities. Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol, Creating the Christmas Spirit. On December 19th, 1843, Chapman and Hall published a short novel by Charles Dickens titled A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. The first edition of 6,000 copies sold out by Christmas Eve. Dickens had scored another success, and he knew it. But he couldn't have known that this slim volume would become perhaps the most influential piece of Christmas literature ever written, that it would shape how English-speaking people understand Christmas more profoundly than any sermon or tradition.
Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol quickly, in just 6 weeks during October and November of 1843. He had recently visited several of the workhouses and schools for poor children in London, appalled by the conditions he witnessed.
He had also been corresponding with reformers about the new poor law, which had made conditions for the destitute even more harsh in an attempt to discourage people from seeking assistance. Dickens was angry, and he channeled that anger into his Christmas story. The plot is familiar to most people today. Ebenezer Scrooge, a miserly businessman who hates Christmas, is visited by the ghost of his former business partner, Jacob Marley, and subsequently by three spirits representing Christmas past, present, and future. Through these encounters, Scrooge confronts his own cruelty and selfishness and the consequences of his actions. He awakens on Christmas morning, transformed, generous, and joyful, determined to make amends and embrace the spirit of the season. The genius of Dickens' story lay in several elements working together. First, it was genuinely moving. Even the most cynical reader could feel something when Scrooge sees his former self as a lonely boy abandoned at school during Christmas, or when he watches the Cratchit family's modest but loving Christmas celebration. Dickens knew how to pluck heartstrings, and he plucked them masterfully. Second, it was a ghost story, fitting into the Victorian tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas. This might seem odd to modern readers who associate ghosts with Halloween, but for Victorians, the dark nights of winter, particularly the longest nights around the solstice, were the proper time for supernatural tales. Ghost stories were entertainment, read aloud in the parlor while the family gathered close to the fire. By framing his morality tale as a ghost story, Dickens made it entertaining as well as instructive. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the story offered a vision of Christmas that was both appealing and achievable. The Cratchits' Christmas, though modest, was filled with love, laughter, and simple pleasures. The goose was small, the pudding nearly a disaster, but the family's joy was unmistakable. Dickens showed that Christmas didn't require wealth, just goodwill and the willingness to make an effort. This democratized the holiday, suggesting that everyone, regardless of class, could have a proper Christmas if they chose to. The character of Tiny Tim, Bob Cratchit's disabled youngest child, became one of the most famous figures in Victorian literature. His cheerful acceptance of his limitations, his faith, and his famous line, "God bless us, everyone," epitomized Victorian sentiments about childhood, disability, and Christian virtue. The threat of his death, and Scrooge's power to prevent it through charity, made the moral lesson intensely personal and urgent. Dickens also embedded detailed descriptions of Christmas celebration throughout the story. The scenes of Victorian London at Christmas, shops full of food, people preparing for feasts, families traveling to gather together, these images fixed in readers' minds what Christmas should look like. When Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas Present visit homes throughout the city, they see Christmas being celebrated in various ways, but all sharing common elements: food, fellowship, generosity, and joy. The transformation of Scrooge provided a narrative of redemption that particularly appealed to Victorian sensibilities. The idea that even the hardest heart could be softened, that it was never too late to change, that Christmas itself had the power to inspire moral transformation, these themes resonated deeply. Scrooge's conversion wasn't religious in any sectarian sense, but it was spiritual, a reclaiming of his humanity through recognition of his connection to others. The book's immediate success spawned numerous adaptations. By February 1844, several theatrical versions were already playing in London. Dickens himself gave public readings from the book, performances that were enormously popular and emotional. Audiences wept openly at Tiny Tim's potential death and cheered at Scrooge's reformation. The story escaped its covers and became part of popular culture almost immediately. A Christmas Carol also influenced how Victorians thought about charity and social responsibility. Before Dickens, Christmas charity had been largely a matter of individual conscience and sporadic giving. After A Christmas Carol, there was increased pressure on the wealthy to be generous at Christmas, to ensure that the poor had decent meals and that children received gifts. The book made it harder to ignore poverty and suffering, particularly during the Christmas season. The famous surplus population line, when Scrooge says the poor should die and decrease the surplus population, directly referenced Malthusian economic theories that were used to justify harsh treatment of the poor. By putting these words in the mouth of the unreformed Scrooge and showing them to be heartless and wrong, Dickens attacked these theories in a way that reached a broad audience. Economic policy debates were made accessible and emotional through fiction. Dickens emphasized family in his Christmas vision. The Cratchits gathered around their table, the various families visited by Scrooge and the ghost, even Scrooge's own lost family connections that he rebuilds by the end, all reinforced the Victorian ideal of Christmas as a family celebration. This was distinct from older, more community-based celebrations. Dickens' Christmas happened primarily within the home, among blood relatives, though it opened outward through charity to include the less fortunate. The food descriptions in A Christmas Carol are lavish and specific. The goose, the pudding, the chestnuts, the punch, all are described with loving detail. Dickens understood that food was central to how many people experienced Christmas, and he made it central to his story. The transformation of Scrooge is partly measured by his willingness to buy the Cratchits a larger turkey, providing abundance where there had been scarcity. The book also influenced the development of Father Christmas, Santa Claus, in Britain. Scrooge's generosity, particularly toward children, modeled the role that Father Christmas would increasingly play. The idea that Christmas should bring gifts to children, that adults had a responsibility to ensure children's Christmas joy, these notions were reinforced and spread by Dickens' story. A Christmas Carol went through multiple editions in Dickens' lifetime, with him making small revisions and additions over the years. It never went out of print. Each Christmas, new editions would appear, and families would read it aloud as part of their celebration. The story became tradition itself, a Christmas ritual of its own. Other writers attempted to emulate Dickens' success with their own Christmas stories. Many of these are now forgotten, but collectively they created a genre of Christmas literature. Sentimental tales with moral lessons, usually involving some form of reconciliation or redemption. This literary tradition influenced how Christmas was understood and celebrated, making the holiday narratively rich, something to be read about and thought about, not just experienced. The influence extended beyond literature. Christmas cards often featured scenes inspired by A Christmas Carol, particularly images of snowy London streets, families gathered around tables, or generous figures distributing gifts to the poor. The visual culture of Christmas was shaped by Dickens' descriptions and the illustrations that accompanied his text. By the end of the Victorian era, many people couldn't imagine Christmas without thinking of Dickens. His vision had become so thoroughly integrated into the holiday that it seemed to have always existed. A Christmas Carol had essentially created, or at least crystallized, the Christmas spirit. That particular combination of nostalgia, generosity, family feeling, and social conscience that defined the Victorian holiday and continues to define it today. Gifts, commerce, and the evolution of Father Christmas. Gift-giving at Christmas seems natural and inevitable to us now. But for most of history, gifts were exchanged at New Year rather than on Christmas Day. The Romans gave gifts during Saturnalia and at the New Year. Medieval Europeans continued this tradition. In early Victorian Britain, the New Year remained the primary time for gifts. The shift from New Year to Christmas happened gradually through the Victorian period and was driven by several factors. First, the royal example mattered. Victoria and Albert exchanged gifts on Christmas Eve, following German custom. This made Christmas gift-giving fashionable among those who followed royal trends. Second, the increasing commercialization of Christmas made gift-giving profitable for retailers, who pushed the association through advertising and promotion. Third, the sentimentalization of childhood made parents want to make Christmas morning magical for their children, and gifts were an obvious way to create that magic. Early in Victoria's reign, toys and gifts for children were handmade and expensive. A wooden toy would be carved by a skilled craftsperson, taking hours or days of work. A doll would be sewn by hand, each detail individually crafted. These items were luxury goods, available only to wealthy families. Middle-class children might receive one gift at Christmas, if any. Working-class children received essentially nothing, perhaps an orange or a few nuts if they were fortunate. The Industrial Revolution changed this dramatically. Factories began mass-producing toys, dolls, toy soldiers, simple mechanical toys with clockwork mechanisms, board games, books. Production costs dropped. Distribution through expanding railways made toys available throughout the country. By the 1870s and 80s, toys had become much more affordable, accessible to the middle class, and, if just barely, of some working-class families. Department stores appeared in major cities during the Victorian period, and quickly realized that Christmas was an opportunity for enormous sales. They created elaborate window displays showing toys and decorations and all the trappings of Christmas celebration. Children would press their faces against the glass, entranced by the displays. Parents would see these displays and feel pressure to provide similar experiences for their own children. The stores also pioneered Christmas shopping as a distinct activity. They stayed open later in December. They hired extra staff. They created special Christmas sections filled with gift possibilities. They advertised heavily in newspapers, telling people what they should buy for Christmas. This commercial machinery transformed Christmas from a religious and cultural celebration into an economic event, a season of consumption on which many businesses depended for a significant portion of their annual revenue. Catalogs allowed people outside major cities to participate in this commercial Christmas. Montgomery Ward and Sears in America, and similar British firms, produced thick Christmas catalogs showing toys, clothes, household goods, everything a family might want for Christmas. These catalogs were pored over by children marking their wishes, by parents trying to figure out what they could afford. The catalog became part of Christmas, a source of anticipation and dreaming. Gift-giving customs varied by class. Wealthy families exchanged expensive, often personalized gifts. Victoria and Albert exchanged jewelry, artwork, and other luxury items. They also established the custom of giving gifts to servants, usually clothing, food, and money. This was expected, part of the household's Christmas responsibility, and servants counted on these gifts as supplements to their regular wages. Middle-class families exchanged modest gifts, practical items like books, handkerchiefs, gloves, small jewelry pieces, along with toys for children. The emphasis was on thoughtfulness rather than expense. Handmade gifts were common and valued. A woman might embroider handkerchiefs for family members. A man might carve something or create some other craft item. These handmade gifts demonstrated care and effort. Working-class children's stockings, which became popular from around 1870 onward, would be filled with small items: an apple, an orange, some nuts, perhaps a small toy if the family could manage it. An orange was a special luxury, imported and expensive, but it became traditional to include one in Christmas stockings. The bright color and sweet smell made it seem like a magical fruit, a taste of lands far away and better times. The stocking tradition itself has murky origins. The story of St. Nicholas leaving gold coins in stockings hung by the fire existed in various forms. But the specific practice of children hanging stockings on Christmas Eve for Father Christmas to fill seems to have solidified during the Victorian period. It provided a ritual that even poor families could participate in, requiring only a stocking, which everyone had, and whatever small items the family could spare.
The figure of Father Christmas underwent transformation during the Victorian period. In earlier British tradition, Father Christmas was a personification of Christmas itself, usually depicted as a jolly old man dressed in green or red, associated more with adult feasting and merriment than with children's gifts. Meanwhile, the Dutch Sinterklaas tradition had come to America with Dutch settlers and evolved into Santa Claus, a gift bringer specifically for children.
The Victorians blended these traditions. The British Father Christmas absorbed characteristics of the American Santa Claus, becoming primarily a gift bringer for children. His appearance standardized. A rotund, jolly old man with a white beard, dressed in red, living at the North Pole, though this detail came later, and traveling by sleigh, pulled by reindeer. This amalgamated figure suited Victorian sentimentality about childhood and their emphasis on Christmas as a family, particularly child-centered celebration. Images of Father Christmas began appearing in Victorian advertisements, children's books, and Christmas cards. Thomas Nast's illustrations in America, showing Santa in his workshop, solidified the visual representation. By the end of the 19th century, Father Christmas/Santa Claus had become a central figure in Christmas mythology, the magical gift-bringer who rewarded good children and supposedly ignored naughty ones. The notion of Santa judging children's behavior year-round and rewarding them accordingly appealed to Victorian ideas about child-rearing and moral development. It provided leverage for parents, encouraging good behavior through the threat of no Christmas gifts. Whether this was genuinely effective or just another anxiety Victorian children learned to navigate is debatable, but the concept became deeply embedded in Christmas tradition. Department stores began featuring Santa Claus in person during the Christmas season. A store employee would dress as Santa, and children could come sit on his lap and tell him what they wanted for Christmas. This practice started in the late Victorian period and accelerated in the early 20th century. It provided another reason for families to visit stores, another opportunity for retailers to encourage Christmas spending. The emphasis on gifts, particularly for children, created new anxieties and obligations. Parents felt pressure to provide adequate Christmas gifts even when finances were tight. The contrast between wealthy children receiving elaborate gifts and poor children receiving little or nothing became more visible and harder to ignore. Charitable organizations responded by organizing Christmas gift programs for poor children, collecting toys and distributing them so that even the poorest children would have something on Christmas morning. Churches were ambivalent about the commercialization of Christmas. On one hand, they wanted Christmas to remain focused on the religious meaning of the holiday, the birth of Christ. On the other hand, they recognized that the gift-giving and celebration brought people together, created joy, and provided opportunities for charity and generosity. Many churches embraced Christmas festivities while trying to maintain religious content and meaning. By the end of Victoria's reign, the pattern was set. Christmas meant gifts, particularly for children. It meant shopping, decorating, and spending money. It meant Santa Claus and stockings hung by the fireplace. The commercial and sentimental elements had fused with religious observance to create a holiday that was simultaneously sacred and secular, spiritual and material, about Christ's birth and about toys under the tree. This tension between the religious and commercial aspects of Christmas, which we still negotiate today, was largely created during the Victorian period. The Victorians embraced both elements without seeing them as necessarily contradictory. Christmas could be about Jesus and about presents, about charity and about shopping. The holiday was capacious enough to contain multiple meanings, and the Victorians, perhaps more than any era before or since, seemed comfortable with that multiplicity. Class divisions at Christmas. The Two Nations. Benjamin Disraeli, who would serve twice as Britain's Prime Minister during Victoria's reign, wrote in 1845 of Britain divided into two nations, the rich and the poor. Nowhere was this division more visible than at Christmas. While the wealthy feasted on turkey and roasted game, while the middle class gathered around their Christmas trees, the poor faced a very different reality. For agricultural laborers, those who worked the farms that fed Britain, Christmas offered little respite. Wages for farm workers averaged 5 shillings a week, barely enough for basic survival, leaving nothing for Christmas luxuries. There was no money for gifts, little for special food, and certainly none for the decorations and celebrations that were becoming standard for the middle class. Christmas Day might see a slightly better meal than usual, but often it meant just another day of hard labor in the cold. In the growing industrial cities, conditions were equally harsh. Factory workers who had migrated from the countryside seeking better opportunities found themselves working 12 or 14-hour days, 6 days a week. Most factories didn't close for Christmas. The machines kept running, and workers had to keep tending them or risk losing their positions. For these workers, Christmas was a day they heard about but didn't experience, a celebration happening somewhere else for someone else. Domestic servants, those who worked in the homes of the middle and upper classes, faced particular complications at Christmas. They were responsible for creating the Christmas celebrations their employers enjoyed. Servants cooked the elaborate meals, set the tables, decorated the homes, served the guests, and cleaned up afterwards. All of this happened on Christmas Day itself, while their own families celebrated without them.
The standard practice was to give servants Boxing Day off, December 26th. On this day, servants might visit their own families if possible, though often the distance was too great. They would receive their Christmas boxes, gifts from their employers, usually money, leftover food from the Christmas feast, and perhaps clothing or other practical items. These boxes were expected, part of the implicit contract of service, and employers who failed to provide adequate boxes earned reputations as miserly. The term Boxing Day derives from these boxes given to servants and tradespeople. The practice extended beyond household servants to include anyone who had provided service throughout the year: postmen, delivery people, lamplighters. On December 26th, these workers would make their rounds collecting Christmas boxes, small tips or gifts acknowledging their year of service. For many working people, these Christmas boxes represented a significant supplement to their regular income.
The workhouse represented the most extreme end of the Victorian social spectrum. These institutions housed those who had no other options: the elderly with no family support, orphaned children, the disabled, the chronically ill, anyone who couldn't support themselves and had nowhere else to go. Conditions in workhouses were deliberately harsh, designed to discourage people from seeking assistance. The new Poor Law of 1834 had made workhouse conditions even more severe. Families were separated, men in one section, women and children in another. The food was minimal, usually bread and watery gruel. Work was hard and pointless, like picking apart old rope or breaking stones. The underlying philosophy was that poverty resulted from moral failing, and harsh conditions would encourage people to find work and support themselves. At Christmas, reformers and the general public paid attention to workhouse conditions in ways they didn't the rest of the year. Newspapers sent reporters to workhouses to describe the Christmas dinner provided to inmates. This public scrutiny created pressure on workhouse guardians to provide decent Christmas meals. Most workhouses did serve beef and plum pudding on Christmas Day with adequate portions. This one meal might be the best food inmates received all year. Even so, the Christmas dinner in a workhouse was a grim affair. Families remained separated. The food, though better than usual, was served in the same bare dining hall, at the same rough tables, under the same regime of rules and discipline. There was no joy, no celebration, just a slightly less miserable meal. Charles Dickens' descriptions of workhouse conditions in Oliver Twist and elsewhere had shocked the Victorian public and increased pressure for reform, but change came slowly. Charitable efforts increased dramatically at Christmas. The better off felt obligated to help the poor during the Christmas season, driven partly by genuine compassion, partly by religious teaching, partly by social pressure, and partly by the fear that desperate poverty might lead to social unrest. Churches organized Christmas dinners for the poor, feeding hundreds or thousands of people in church halls and public spaces. These charity dinners were well-intentioned but often awkward. The poor were expected to be appropriately grateful, to demonstrate their worthiness through proper behavior and expressions of thankfulness. The well-off who organized and served these dinners expected deference and respect. The power dynamics were unequal and obvious. Still, for many poor families, these charity dinners provided their only experience of a proper Christmas meal, and they attended, grateful despite the humiliation. Charitable organizations also distributed Christmas gifts, particularly for poor children. Middle-class ladies would organize toy collections, gathering donated and purchased toys to give to workhouse children and other poor children. On Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, these gifts would be distributed, usually with some ceremony, sometimes with the donors present to witness the children's gratitude. The children would be expected to say thank you properly, to show that they were being raised with correct values despite their poverty. The railways, expanding rapidly through the Victorian period, had an unexpected social impact on Christmas. Workers who had migrated to cities for factory jobs could now travel home for Christmas, distance and cost permitting. Railway companies, recognizing the demand, offered special Christmas excursion rates, making travel more affordable. For the first time, working-class families separated by employment could reunite for the holiday. This transformed Christmas from a static local celebration into something more dynamic. People traveled to be with family. This meant more people experiencing Christmas away from their usual surroundings, more mixing of different regional traditions, and a gradual homogenization of Christmas customs as people shared practices and borrowed elements from each other. Still, the gulf between rich and poor Christmas experiences remained vast. A wealthy child might receive dozens of gifts on Christmas morning, wake to a house full of decorations, and eat from a table groaning with food. A poor child might receive nothing, or perhaps an orange and a handful of nuts if fortunate. The wealthy child lived in a house heated throughout. The poor child might live in a single room, unheated, shared with an entire family.
Middle-class Victorians were increasingly troubled by these inequalities, particularly at Christmas. The holiday's emphasis on children made poverty's impact on children especially troubling. How could society celebrate Christmas, supposedly a time of goodwill and peace, while allowing children to suffer from cold and hunger? This tension drove much of the Victorian charitable impulse, but it also revealed the limitations of that charity. Individual generosity could ease specific cases of suffering, but couldn't address the systemic issues creating that suffering. Some Victorians recognized this. Social reformers like Charles Booth and Henry Mayhew documented the living conditions of the London poor, making it impossible for the comfortable to plead ignorance. Their research revealed that up to 2/3 of the working class lived in or near poverty, that the problems were structural rather than individual, that simple charity wasn't sufficient. But translating this understanding into policy and action proved difficult. Victorian Britain was deeply committed to laissez-faire economics and individual responsibility, doctrines that resisted systemic intervention. At Christmas, these contradictions became particularly visible. The same society that celebrated family and home allowed families to live in desperate conditions. The same society that exchanged elaborate gifts allowed children to go without food. The same society that sang carols about peace and goodwill maintained harsh workhouses and inequitable labor conditions. Christmas, rather than papering over these contradictions, actually highlighted them, created a moment when the gap between ideal and reality became impossible to ignore. This tension never resolved during the Victorian period. Christmas remained a deeply class-divided experience. The wealthy and middle class celebrated elaborately. The poor got by as best they could, sometimes aided by charity, sometimes not. The holiday embodied both Victorian generosity and Victorian inequality, both the aspiration to a better society and the reality of profound social division. Decorations and symbolism, making homes festive. Beyond the Christmas tree, Victorians filled their homes with decorations that turned ordinary parlors and dining rooms into festive spaces. These decorations drew on multiple traditions, some ancient, some recent, blending pagan symbolism with Christian meaning and adding the Victorian love of visual abundance. Holly and ivy were perhaps the most traditional decorations, their use stretching back to pre-Christian times. Evergreens had long been brought indoors during winter as symbols of continuing life when everything else appeared dead. Holly, with its sharp leaves and red berries, carried rich symbolic meaning. The leaves represented Christ's crown of thorns, the berries his blood. But holly also had older associations with protection against evil spirits and bad luck. Ivy, with its ability to cling and climb and remain green year-round, symbolized eternity and fidelity. The combination of holly and ivy appears in medieval carols, often presented as male and female respectively, their intertwining representing partnership and completion. Victorian families would gather holly and ivy from the countryside if they lived rurally, or purchase it from markets if they lived in cities. The gathering of greenery became a family activity. In rural areas, children would go with their father or older siblings to gather armloads of holly, ivy, and other evergreens. Care had to be taken to find holly with good berries, as the berries were essential to the decoration. Back home, these greenery bundles would be used to create garlands, swags, and arrangements throughout the house. Windows and door frames would be lined with garlands of evergreens, sometimes interwoven with ribbons. Mantelpieces would be draped with greenery, often with candles placed among the branches, creating a beautiful, if somewhat fire-prone display. The greenery would fill the house with a fresh, resinous smell that became associated with Christmas itself. Mistletoe held particular significance and was treated somewhat separately from other evergreens. This parasitic plant, which grows on the branches of other trees, had ancient associations with fertility and romance. By Victorian times, the custom of kissing under the mistletoe was well established, though carefully regulated by rules of propriety. The practice was that a young man could kiss a young lady standing under the mistletoe, but only once per berry on the mistletoe bunch. After each kiss, a berry would be removed. When the berries were gone, the kissing privilege expired. This created both opportunity and limits, allowing for romantic interaction within acceptable bounds. A young lady who refused to kiss under the mistletoe was said to risk bad luck in finding a husband the following year, a superstition that conveniently pressured women to participate in the custom. Mistletoe was typically hung in doorways or from ceiling beams, places where people would naturally pass. The element of surprise and spontaneity was part of the appeal. Someone might find themselves under the mistletoe without planning to be, creating opportunities for romantic interactions that wouldn't otherwise occur within the strict Victorian social code. Candles played an enormous role in Victorian Christmas decoration. Placed on the Christmas tree, arranged among mantelpiece greenery, set in windows, candles created the warm, flickering light that defined the Victorian Christmas aesthetic. Of course, they also created a significant fire hazard, and candles were monitored carefully, lit only when people were present and watching. The candles in windows served a practical and symbolic purpose. Practically, they helped light the dark winter streets and welcomed visitors. Symbolically, they represented the Star of Bethlehem, guiding travelers home, or more broadly, the light of Christ entering a dark world. The glow of candles in windows became a signal that Christmas was being celebrated within, that the house was festive and welcoming. Bells became an important Christmas decoration during the Victorian period, both as physical objects hung in homes and as a recurring motif in Christmas imagery. Church bells ringing on Christmas Day called people to worship and announced the holiday to the community. Small decorative bells might be hung on the Christmas tree or incorporated into garlands.
The sound of bells, bright and clear, symbolized joy and celebration. Ribbons and bows in red, green, white, and gold appeared throughout Victorian Christmas decorating. These colors became strongly associated with Christmas. Red represented Christ's blood and the holly berries. Green represented evergreen life and hope. White represented purity and snow. Gold represented the gifts of the Magi and heavenly glory. Victorians were quite conscious of color symbolism and used it deliberately in their decorating.
Paper decorations were popular, especially in middle-class homes. Paper chains, made by children cutting strips of colored paper and gluing them into interlocking loops, could stretch across entire rooms. Paper snowflakes, cut with scissors in intricate patterns, would be pasted to windows. More elaborate paper decorations could be purchased. Elaborate die-cut designs of angels, bells, or winter scenes, often gilded or silvered. The Victorians also decorated with natural items beyond evergreens. Pine cones might be gathered and used in arrangements. Nuts, particularly walnuts, might be spray-painted gold or silver and hung as ornaments or arranged in bowls. Apples and oranges weren't just for eating. They might be studded with cloves and used as decorations, filling rooms with spicy sweet scents. The decoration process happened gradually through December. Trees went up close to Christmas, but other decorations might appear earlier. By mid-December, respectable Victorian homes would be noticeably festive, signaling to visitors and passers-by that the family observed the holiday properly. The decorations were a form of social communication, demonstrating taste, celebrating participation in shared traditions, and creating an environment conducive to celebration. After Christmas came the important ritual of taking down decorations. The traditional date for this was Twelfth Night, January 5th, marking the end of the Christmas season. Greenery would be carefully collected and, according to tradition, burned. To leave Christmas greenery up beyond Twelfth Night was considered very bad luck. This created a clear endpoint to the season, a definite moment when Christmas ended and regular life resumed. The act of decorating itself was as important as the finished result. It provided family activities, opportunities for creativity, and ways of marking the approaching holiday. Children could help make paper chains or arrange greenery. Artistic family members could create elaborate decorations. Everyone participated in transforming the ordinary home into a Christmas space. These decorations also represented the Victorian desire to control and beautify their environment. The dark, cold, industrial world outside could be frightening and overwhelming. But inside, the home could be made warm, bright, and beautiful. Christmas decorations turned the home into a refuge, a haven, a space set apart from ordinary concerns. This suited the Victorian ideal of separate spheres, where home was sacred space and external world was profane, where moral and spiritual values could be cultivated within the protected domestic environment. The symbolism embedded in these decorations gave them deeper meaning beyond mere prettiness. Every holly leaf, every candle flame, every ribbon and bell carried significance. Victorians were comfortable with symbolic thinking, with objects representing larger ideas. Christmas decorations weren't just for show. They told a story,
communicated values, and helped create the sacred atmosphere that made Christmas special. The lasting legacy: how the Victorians made our Christmas. When Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901, she had reigned for 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her. The entire concept of Victorian had become synonymous with an era, a set of values, and a way of life. And nowhere was Victorian influence more complete and lasting than in Christmas. The Christmas we celebrate today, regardless of where we are in the English-speaking world, is recognizably Victorian. The decorated tree, the cards, the gifts for children, the carols, the feast, Father Christmas, the emphasis on family, all these elements were created, revived, or popularized during Victoria's reign. Without the Victorians, Christmas would be nearly unrecognizable to us. Consider what didn't exist before the Victorians. There were no Christmas trees in British homes. No Christmas cards were sent. Santa Claus was unknown in Britain. Gift-giving happened at New Year, not Christmas. Most people didn't have time off work for the holiday. There were few Christmas carols being sung. Christmas was a minor holiday, hardly celebrated outside of religious services. Within a few decades, all this changed. By the end of Victoria's reign, Christmas had become the most important holiday of the year, the emotional and commercial centerpiece around which British culture organized itself each December. This transformation was remarkably rapid and remarkably thorough. The Victorians didn't just modify existing Christmas traditions, they essentially created a new Christmas that felt traditional but was actually revolutionary. Several factors enabled this transformation. The Industrial Revolution created the economic conditions that made widespread Christmas celebration possible. Factories could mass-produce decorations, toys, and goods that were previously handmade luxuries. Railways allowed families to travel for holiday gatherings and enabled the distribution of goods to all corners of Britain. Growing prosperity among the middle class provided money to spend on Christmas celebration. But economics alone doesn't explain the Victorian Christmas. Cultural factors mattered equally. The Victorian emphasis on family made a home-centered holiday appealing. The Victorian love of sentiment and ritual provided the emotional content that made Christmas meaningful. The Victorian ability to blend religious and secular elements created a holiday that could appeal to different sensibilities and motivations. The royal family's example provided a model to follow. Victoria and Albert's Christmas celebrations, widely publicized and emulated, showed the middle class how to celebrate. The royal imprimatur made Christmas respectable and aspirational. If the Queen decorated a tree and exchanged gifts, then clearly these were proper activities for respectable families. Charles Dickens' influence cannot be overstated. A Christmas Carol and his other Christmas writings shaped how people understood the holiday. Dickens made Christmas about charity, family, nostalgia, and moral redemption. His vision of Christmas, sentimental and social, aligned perfectly with Victorian values and gave the holiday a cultural narrative that extended beyond religious observance. The commercial sector eagerly promoted Christmas once they recognized its profit potential. Department stores, advertisers, toy manufacturers, food sellers, they all had incentives to encourage Christmas spending. Their efforts created a self-reinforcing cycle where commercial promotion increased celebration, which increased commercial opportunity, which led to more promotion. By the end of the Victorian era, Christmas was big business.
The Victorian Christmas also exported beyond Britain. The British Empire, at its height during Victoria's reign, spread British culture worldwide. British emigrants to America, Canada, Australia, and other countries took their Christmas customs with them. American writers like Washington Irving and Clement Clark Moore contributed their own elements, but the basic template remained Victorian. The class division, the Victorian Christmas, also exported beyond Britain. The British Empire, at its height during Victoria's reign, spread British culture worldwide. British emigrants to America, Canada, Australia, and other countries took their Christmas customs with them. American writers like Washington Irving and Clement Clark Moore contributed their own elements, but the basic template remained Victorian. The class divisions that characterized Victorian Christmas persisted beyond Victoria's reign. The working class eventually gained time off for Christmas as labor reforms advanced. The commercialization that began in Victorian times accelerated through the 20th century. The religious content, always present but never exclusive, gradually diminished as Christmas became increasingly secular. But the basic structure remained recognizably Victorian. Some Victorian Christmas practices have faded or transformed. Candles on trees gave way to electric lights, much safer though perhaps less atmospheric. Paper decorations became plastic. Homemade gifts gave way almost entirely to purchased ones. The extended Christmas season that once lasted until Twelfth Night now often ends on December 26th, with decorations coming down on Boxing Day. But these are variations on Victorian themes rather than departures from them. The Victorian emphasis on Christmas as a children's holiday has only intensified. If anything, modern Christmas is even more focused on children than Victorian Christmas was, with elaborate gift-giving, extensive marketing aimed at children, and the construction of childhood Christmas as a magical experience that adults work to create and preserve. The tension between religious and commercial elements that troubled some Victorians remains with us. We still debate whether Christmas has become too commercial, whether the religious meaning has been lost, whether the holiday creates more stress than joy. These are Victorian anxieties, inherited from the people who first grappled with Christmas as a mass cultural and commercial event. The Victorian gift for creating tradition that feels ancient while actually being modern remains impressive. They took fragments, German customs, half-remembered carols, old superstitions about evergreens, and wove them into what appeared to be a timeless whole. Within a generation, people forgot that their grandparents hadn't celebrated Christmas this way. The Victorian Christmas became the traditional Christmas, the way things had supposedly always been done. This creation of instant tradition served Victorian purposes. It provided stability and continuity during a period of rapid change. It gave middle-class families rituals that marked them as respectable. It created a shared culture that crossed regional and class boundaries, at least partially. Christmas became one of the ways Victorians defined themselves and their society. The Victorian Christmas also reflected Victorian contradictions.
It was generous and acquisitive, spiritual and material, inclusive and exclusive. It celebrated home and family while relying on servants who couldn't be with their families. It preached charity while maintaining stark class divisions. It emphasized religious meaning while becoming increasingly commercial. These contradictions didn't trouble the Victorians as much as they trouble us, perhaps because they were comfortable holding multiple, sometimes conflicting values simultaneously.
As Victoria's reign ended and the 20th century began, Christmas continued evolving. New technologies brought new elements: electric lights, recorded music, eventually television specials and movies. The scale of commercialization increased beyond anything the Victorians could have imagined. The religious content continued its gradual decline in secular societies. But the Victorian template remained recognizable underneath these changes. When we decorate a Christmas tree, we are following Prince Albert's example. When we send Christmas cards, we are participating in Henry Cole's innovation. When we exchange gifts on Christmas Day, we are adopting the Victorian shift from New Year to Christmas. When we sing carols, many of them were collected or composed by Victorians. When we eat turkey, we are following Victorian fashion. When we watch A Christmas Carol in any of its countless adaptations, we are engaging with Dickens's vision directly. The Victorian Christmas was a construction, a creation, but it was a successful one. It gave people rituals and meanings that resonated with their lives and values. It provided structure for celebration and opportunities for connection. It made midwinter a time of light and warmth rather than darkness and cold. It turned a religious observance that had nearly died out into the most important secular holiday of the year. So, as you celebrate this Christmas, whenever you are hearing this, know that you are participating in traditions that are barely over a century old but feel timeless. The Victorians made our Christmas, for better and worse. They gave us beauty and sentiment, family gathering and commercial excess, charity and inequality, all wrapped up in a package that we unwrap every December without fully realizing its origins. The lights on your tree, the cards in your mailbox, the gifts under the tree, the carols on the radio, the family gathered around the table, all echo with Victorian voices, reflect Victorian values, and embody Victorian dreams. The Christmas they created outlived them and shows no signs of fading. In that sense, Victoria's reign continues every December. When we step into the warm glow of a Victorian parlor, whether we know it or not, celebrating the holiday they made for us, shaped by their hopes and contradictions, their sentiments and their commerce, their faith and their doubt. And in the quiet of this moment, as you drift toward sleep with these stories settling around you like gentle snow, remember that Christmas itself is a gift passed down through generations, reshaped by each era, but recognizably the same celebration that brought joy and connection to people living in a very different world more than a century ago. Their Christmas became our Christmas, and in celebrating it, we keep alive not just their traditions, but their hope that midwinter darkness could be pushed back, that families could gather, that generosity could flourish, and that every year, for at least a few days, the world could be a little bit warmer, a little bit kinder, a little bit more like the Christmas they imagined. If you've enjoyed this journey through Victorian Christmas history, and if it's helped you drift peacefully toward sleep, I'd be grateful if you'd like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the creation of more long-form historical content, your contributions help more than you know. Until next time, sleep well, and may your Christmas, whenever it comes, be merry and bright.